August 21, 1971, 9:15 p.m. Plaza Miranda, in Quiapo, Manila. 8,000 people gathered for what they thought was just another political rally. The Liberal Party, the main opposition to Ferdinand Marcos, was introducing their candidates for the upcoming Senate elections. It was democracy in action, loud, chaotic, beautiful Filipino democracy. Then the world exploded. 2 grenades detonated in the middle of the crowd. 9 people died instantly. 95 more were wounded, many of them permanently maimed. Blood covered the historic plaza. Screams filled the night air. And in Malacanang Palace, Ferdinand Marcos was ready with his response before the smoke had even cleared. Communist terrorists, he announced within hours. An attack on democracy itself. But what if the real terrorist was the man pointing the finger? What if Ferdinand Marcos had just bombed his own country's politicians and blamed his enemies for it? This isn't just the story of a bombing, this is the story of how Ferdinand Marcos perfected the art of the false flag operation, and used it to justify the destruction of Philippine democracy. To understand Plaza Miranda, you need to understand Ferdinand Marcos in 1971. He was desperate. His second presidential term was ending in 1973, and the Philippine Constitution prohibited him from running again. The Liberal Party was gaining momentum. Their candidates were polling well for the Senate elections. Worse, they were talking about changing the Constitution to prevent any future president from becoming another Marcos. Marcos faced a choice: accept the end of his political career, or find a way to stay in power. He chose option 3, create a crisis so severe that staying in power would look like patriotic duty instead of authoritarian ambition. But this required an enemy. Not just a political opponent, but an existential threat to the Philippines itself. Someone so dangerous that suspending the Constitution would seem reasonable. Someone so evil that martial law would look like salvation. The problem was, in 1971, the Philippines didn't have that kind of enemy. The communist insurgency was real, but small. The opposition was vocal but democratic. Student protests were passionate but peaceful. None of these presented the kind of clear and present danger that would justify emergency powers. That's when Marcos decided to manufacture the crisis himself. The planning began months before Plaza Miranda. Marcos had been studying other leaders who had successfully used false flag operations to consolidate power. Hitler's Reichstag fire, Stalin's provocations. The pattern was always the same: stage an attack that appears to come from your enemies, then use the public's fear and anger to justify extreme measures. But Marcos had advantages those leaders didn't. He controlled the military. He controlled the intelligence services. He controlled most of the media. And most importantly, he controlled the investigation of whatever crime he chose to commit. The beauty of Plaza Miranda, from Marcos's perspective, was that it would accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. It would eliminate or intimidate opposition leaders. It would create the communist threat he needed to justify emergency powers. It would demonstrate to the Filipino people that democracy was too dangerous to continue. And it would do all of this while making him look like the victim's protector rather than their attacker. But executing a false flag operation requires careful timing and perfect coordination. Every detail must be planned in advance. Every piece of evidence must point toward your chosen enemy. Every witness must tell the story you want told. And every investigation must reach the conclusion you need reach. The Liberal Party rally at Plaza Miranda was the perfect target. It was public, well-announced, and would be packed with opposition leaders and their supporters. Security would be minimal because it was a political event, not a government function. And most importantly, if something terrible happened there, everyone would assume it was politically motivated. August 21, 1971, 8:00 p.m. The rally began exactly as planned. Liberal Party candidates took the stage to introduce themselves to the crowd. Jovido Salonga, the party's expected presidential candidate for 1973. Sergio Osmeña Jr., former senator and son of a former president. John Osmeña, Sergio's son and rising political star. Gerardo Roxas, Eva Estrada Cala, Genaro Magsaysay Jr. The cream of the opposition leadership, all gathered in one place. What they didn't know was that they were being watched. Not just by their supporters in the crowd, but by intelligence operatives who had been tracking their movements for weeks. Not just by local police providing routine security, but by military assets positioned around the plaza. Not just by journalists covering the rally, but by government agents documenting everything for posterity. Every word spoken from that stage was being recorded. Every face in the crowd was being photographed. Every entrance and exit was being monitored. because whatever happened next, the government wanted complete documentation of the scene. At 9:10 p.m., the speeches were winding down. Jovito Salonga was speaking about the need for change in Philippine politics, about the dangers of authoritarianism, about the importance of defending democratic institutions. The crowd was engaged, but not agitated. It was exactly the kind of peaceful political gathering that had been happening in the Philippines for decades. Then at 9:15 p.m., everything changed. Two explosions, seconds apart, ripped through the stage area. The first grenade landed near the speaker's platform, directly in front of the opposition leaders. The second landed in the crowd of supporters. The timing was perfect to cause maximum casualties and maximum psychological impact. Jovito Salonga lost his left eye and suffered severe leg injuries. Sergio Osmeña Jr. lost both legs below the knee. John Osmeña lost a leg and suffered internal injuries. 6 other opposition figures were critically wounded. In the crowd, 9 people died instantly, including a photographer and several campaign workers. 95 more were injured, many of them losing limbs or suffering permanent disability. But here's what the survivors remembered that didn't match the official story. The grenades weren't thrown from the crowd. They appeared to come from above, possibly from surrounding buildings. The explosions were too perfectly timed and too precisely placed to be random acts of violence. And most disturbing, some witnesses reported seeing government agents filming the attack rather than responding to it. Within hours before any real investigation could begin, Ferdinand Marcos was on television. He condemned the communist terrorist attack on Philippine democracy. He announced the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, allowing the military to arrest and detain anyone suspected of subversive activities. He declared that the Philippines was under attack from enemies of the state who would stop at nothing to destroy freedom. The investigation that followed was a masterclass in manufactured evidence and predetermined conclusions. Military investigators immediately focused on communist groups, despite having no evidence linking them to the attack. Suspects were arrested within days, their confessions extracted through interrogation techniques that would later be revealed as torture. But the real evidence pointed in a different direction. The grenades used in the attack were military-grade explosives, not the crude devices typically used by insurgent groups. The tactical precision of the attack suggested professional training and detailed intelligence about the event. Most tellingly, government agents seemed remarkably well prepared to respond to an attack they claimed was a complete surprise. More disturbing were the political consequences that followed. Every objective achieved by the bombing directly benefited Ferdinand Marcos and harmed his opponents. The Liberal Party's leadership was decimated. Their presidential prospects were literally blown up. Public opinion shifted toward supporting stronger security measures. And Congress, intimidated by the violence, became much less willing to challenge Marcos on constitutional issues. It was almost as if someone had planned the perfect crime to solve all of Ferdinand Marcos's political problems at once. But the most damning evidence came from what happened after Plaza Miranda. Instead of hunting down the real perpetrators, the government used the attack to justify an unprecedented crackdown on civil liberties. Thousands of people were arrested without charges. Student organizations were banned. Opposition newspapers were shut down. Labor unions were infiltrated and controlled. The communist threat that the bombing had supposedly revealed became the justification for transforming the Philippines from a democracy into a police state. And every step of that transformation had been planned in advance, just waiting for the right crisis to justify it. The media coverage of Plaza Miranda was carefully managed from the beginning. Government-friendly newspapers immediately identified the attack as communist terrorism. Opposition newspapers that asked uncomfortable questions found themselves facing censorship or closure. International media were given limited access and guided toward pre-approved sources and conclusions. Witnesses who contradicted the official story found themselves facing harassment or arrest. Investigators who pursued inconvenient leads were reassigned or dismissed. Evidence that didn't support the communist theory was lost or misfiled. The Plaza Miranda investigation became a textbook example of how to control a narrative by controlling the investigation. 1 year later, September 21, 1972, Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law. In his announcement to the Filipino people, he cited the Plaza Miranda bombing as evidence of the communist threat that justified suspending the constitution and assuming dictatorial powers. The attack that had happened 13 months earlier was still being used to justify the destruction of Philippine democracy. But by then, some people were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. Why had the government's response to Plaza Miranda been so well coordinated and prepared? Why had all the evidence pointed so conveniently toward Marcos's political chimneys? Why had every consequence of the bombing benefited the man who claimed to be fighting against its perpetrators? Years later, after martial law had ended and Ferdinand Marcos had been driven from power, more evidence emerged about Plaza Miranda. Former military officers came forward with stories about false flag operations. Intelligence documents were leaked revealing government knowledge of the attack before it happened. Witnesses who had been silenced by fear finally spoke about what they had really seen that night. The picture that emerged was damning. Plaza Miranda wasn't a communist attack on Philippine democracy. It was Ferdinand Marcos's attack on his own people, designed to create the crisis he needed to justify destroying the democracy he was to protect. But perhaps the most chilling evidence came from Marcos himself. In private conversations recorded years later, he was heard discussing false flag operations as legitimate tools of statecraft. He talked about the need to create situations that justify strong government action. He described political violence as sometimes necessary to prevent greater violence later. It was the mindset of a man who believed that the ends justified any means, including bombing his own country's politicians and blaming it on his enemies. The human cost of Plaza Miranda was immediate and devastating. 9 people died, 95 were wounded. The careers of opposition leaders were ended, but the political cost was far greater. The bombing became the justification for martial law, which lasted 14 years and cost thousands of lives. Every person killed during martial law, every opponent tortured, every journalist silenced, every institution destroyed, all of it traced back to those 2 grenades that exploded at Plaza Miranda on August 24. The families of Plaza Miranda victims spent decades seeking justice. They filed lawsuits, demanded investigations, and fought for recognition that their loved ones had been victims of state terrorism, not communist violence. Most of them died without ever justice served. Today, Plaza Miranda looks much the same as it did in 1971. The same historic buildings surround the same public square. Political rallies still happen there. Democracy, damaged but not destroyed, continues to function in the Philippines. But there's no monument to the victims of the bombing. No official recognition of what really happened that night. No acknowledgement that Ferdinand Marcos used their blood to justify the destruction of their democracy. The lesson of Plaza Miranda isn't just about one bombing or one dictator. It's about how democracies die. Not always through dramatic coups or foreign invasions, but through manufactured crises that convince people to trade their freedoms for security. Through false flag operations that create the very threats they claim to fight. Through leaders who destroy democracy while claiming to save it. Ferdinand Marcos pioneered techniques that would be copied by authoritarian leaders around the world. Stage an attack. Blame your enemies. Use the public's fear to justify extreme measures. Control the investigation to ensure it reaches the conclusions you need. Use the crisis to accumulate powers you never give back. It's a playbook that's been used successfully in dozens of countries since 1971. And it all started with 2 grenades in a crowded plaza in Manila, thrown by agents of the very government that claimed to be protecting its people. August 21st, 1971. 2 explosions. 13 months later, martial law. 14 years later, democracy and ruin. All because Ferdinand Marcos understood something that his opponents didn't. Sometimes the most effective way to destroy your enemies is to convince everyone else that they're trying to destroy you. The communist threat that Ferdinand Marcos used to justify martial law was real. But the communist attack at Plaza Miranda was not. The real attack on Philippine democracy came from inside Malacanang Palace, carried out by the man sworn to defend the constitution he was secretly planning to suspend. Today, investigators and historians still debate the exact details of Plaza Miranda. Who placed the grenades? Who gave the orders? How much did Marcos personally know in advance? But they don't debate the larger truth. Plaza Miranda was a false flag operation designed to justify the destruction of Philippine democracy. And it worked exactly as planned. Ferdinand Marcos didn't need to prove his enemies were dangerous. He just needed to make them look dangerous. 2 grenades in a crowded plaza did that perfectly. 9 dead, 95 wounded. 14 years of martial law, thousands of additional casualties. All because one man was willing to bomb his own people to stay in power. Plaza Miranda proved that Ferdinand Marcos was capable of anything. And over the next 14 years of martial law, he proved it again and again and again.